Hi, thank you for tuning in to the Shepherd Podcast. This is a time when we like to introduce you to some people in the ministry at Shepherd, or maybe some people that you've seen and known, and to give you a little more background on who they are, perhaps some things you didn't know about them. My guest for today is someone that a lot of people know at Shepherd of the Hills because he's been a part of this ministry for approximately 4 decades. It's a great honor and joy to be able to welcome onto the show our Director of Operations, Tim Eickstead. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes. So, Director of Operations. People probably have seen you do many different things on this campus. You've worn a lot of hats. You tend to be very active on campus when things are happening. What exactly does the Director of Operations do at Shepherd of the Hills?
Director of Operations as a position was designed to take advantage of the resources that Shepherd of the Hills has, and then also to position us for significant ministry in the future. That sounds like a big term and a quick job description, but what it involves is having the opportunity to work with people, to work with finances, and to figure out how we can make things happen in the ministry here today. When COVID happened, how can we afford to do some of the cameras and the shows and the things that we've done? How can we change a little bit of direction, and where do we find those finances? And then at the same time, like right now, we're redoing carpet, make sure that the details of taking care of moving furniture and other things are accomplished. And then with our building program, we have Dave Kotwitz and his team, and they're doing a tremendous job of making sure things are lined up. Even though we're stopped at the moment, we're in the process. In fact, right now they're finishing up gas tests and getting things going so we can move forward again. But positioning ourselves for that future things that happen. You worked really hard with the congregation in setting up what that new building would look like, and then bringing that to a completion so that we have the opportunity to move forward with that. So some things are day-to-day operations, and some things are looking into the future, how they're going to happen, and then that also involves working with both school and childcare and church budget, and figuring out how those ministries can continue to operate within the parameters of the finances that we have.
Mm-hmm. That's a very clear description. It involves a lot of different things. You mentioned school and childcare as well. Very few people know the ministry as well as you do at Shepherd of the Hills. You and Debbie have been a part of this place for about 4 decades. We're 39 years at this point, right?
39 and pushing it. This is the 40th year.
Yeah. Yeah. So we want to talk a little more about your history. Of course, Debbie is a teacher at the school and has been a part of our school ministry throughout your time here. Your time, I was doing the math in my head. You've been Director of Operations almost as long as you were principal at this point.
Just about.
Yeah, you were principal, I believe, for 21 years. And then Director of Operations for 18 years, if I'm doing my math correctly. Yeah. So both of those roles, I'd like to talk about both of them. But first, I thought perhaps we could go back to an earlier time in your life and to think about how you became the person that you are today. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and what life was like for you in your childhood?
I grew up in Northern Illinois, which is Belvedere, Illinois, which is 90 miles west of Chicago, but not Chicago. It's country and small town of 10,000 people. Debbie actually grew up in Rockford, and I grew up first 5 years of my life in town in a 2-story 1950s house. And probably the 2 things that I remember the most out of that is my dad had built my brother a train track, the big O-gauge train track that came down from the wall, and you flattened it out and it laid there, and then it folded back up, kind of like a Murphy bed. And the other was a big old blue spruce pine tree that we would play hide and seek underneath out in the front yard. And then we moved when I was 5 out to the farm. Our paint store, my mom and dad ran a paint store in town, and it had burned down. And in town, some kids were playing in the store next door that was abandoned, and they left a candle going, and it burned the paint store down. And we moved the paint store out to our family farm, and moved in. My grandma had passed away from a stroke about that time, and our grandpa moved in with us, and we moved out there to a two-story big brick farmhouse, where I grew up with horses and grew up with him. My grandpa cleaning the barns in the morning and the afternoon. So at one point we had 16 horses and a collie, just like Cooper, except he was a black and white and brown collie. He was a tri, and grew up with him as a kid. And Laddie, so just like Lassie, but Laddie. And had a great time. Learned to be independent because I was the baby of the family, which my brother and sisters was, you're the baby, so you get away with everything. And it's like, well, I don't know if I get away with anything. I just kind of watched what you did and tried not to be, if I did it, I didn't want to be caught at it, because I saw what happened to you. So they were good teachers in that respect. But I grew up independently because I was the baby. I was born when Mom was 39. And so I had the opportunity a lot to be on my own. My sister and I would take our horses and we'd pack a lunch and we'd go riding for 5 or 6 hours out into the country, and then eat lunch, turn around and come back. And so it was very independent kind of childhood. And then at the same time, one filled with responsibilities, from helping Dad unpack paint in the store and doing things there to cleaning the barns with Grandpa. And then I had the privilege of going to a Lutheran school, and grew up in that Lutheran school, and then went to Lutheran high school. So I've been a part of Lutheran education all my life. Yeah. And just on a side note, Debbie and I grew up as rivals in sports. She was at St. Paul and Rockford, and I was at Emmanuel and Belvedere. And something you may not know, but when we came to Shepherd and it came time to pick team colors and team names, for the first time that we had teams, her team was the Rams, St. Paul Rams. So we became the Rams, and were the Knights, and our colors were blue and white. And so Shepherd became blue and white and the Rams, and that's how those things happened at Shepherd.
Well, how about that? That's very interesting. Yeah. Now, you and Debbie, at what point in life did you meet?
We met in high school. She was a year behind me. So I graduated in 1975, and she graduated in 76. I always tell the story. We went to high school together. Didn't necessarily hang out together, but in my last year, I asked Debbie to dance, and Debbie wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be a slow dance, so she wanted to be. But it turned out that they had a dance contest at the same time. And so I went and found somebody else who would dance with me, and we ended up winning the dance contest. And then Debbie wrote in my yearbook, when you come back from college, let's go dancing. And so we ended up dating. When I came back, I went to Concordia Austin for 2 years, and it was just a 2-year school. And then when I transferred to Concordia River Forest, and Debbie was on the transfer team on purpose. and we've been together ever since that time. We started dating after that.
Wow. And just from my opinion, I think you guys are one of the great couples at Shepherd of the Hills. You're very united in your purpose and obviously love each other very much. So I certainly look up to both of you for that.
It's been a wonderful we're going on 41 years, and actually going on 42. So it's been a blessing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you went to Concordia University in Austin for 2 years, transferred back up to Concordia River Forest, which is Chicago.
Right.
Why'd you go all the way to Texas?
Came to Texas because the Larry Meisler had come, Pastor Meisler's dad had come up to Rockford Lutheran High School and had recruited some people, and I was the one who came down. I don't know if anybody else came down. I don't think so. I came down to play baseball and ended up getting down here, and then as it happened, the coach that was doing the baseball then ended up not keeping any of the people who were working teacher candidates and pastoral candidates on the team, and a team from TCU sent its freshman and sophomore ball players down to Concordia, Austin to get a little experience, and so they ended up playing on the team, and the rest of us who had come to kind of just as pastoral or teacher students ended up cut from the team. But actually that was a wonderful thing, because then I got to go every weekend and on the trips that were done by the biology group, we got to go to all of the provinces of Texas and the different geographical areas and have weekend trips. And that was a lot of fun and a lot of opportunity to learn science by doing science.
Yeah.
So it turned out to be a real blessing. And then Concordia Austin was still a 2-year school, so transferred back up to Concordia River Forest. And I can remember the first time my dad drove down with me to Austin. I drove him to the airport. He got on a plane to go back to Illinois, and I pulled out of the airport and realized I'm 1,200 miles from home and I know nobody. Yeah. That was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Did you and Debbie stay in contact while you were in Austin?
No. We were. She was at Seward when she graduated. She was at Seward for a semester, and then she transferred back to Concordia River Forest, and then we met when she was on the transfer team. But no, we hadn't really talked to each other since I graduated high school.
Okay. Did you get married right after college?
We got married the last semester of college. We got married in the fall, and it was Debbie's last semester. It was my last semester. It was her last year. I finished in December, and then went on to actually worked at a furniture store there for that spring semester, and Debbie was finishing up her early childhood degree then.
Okay. Now, before you came here at Shepherd of the Hills, your first call was in New Orleans for 1 year, right? You and Debbie both were called there as teachers. Can you tell us about that experience, that 1 year in New Orleans, your first call? Because I know it really made a deep impression on you for good reasons and not so good reasons. And the things you learned there, you brought a lot of those lessons here for the better.
Yeah, it was a learning place. One of the interesting parts of that was we used to go to the library, look at the newspapers and looking at places for calls and wondering where God would send us. And Debbie really wanted to be in warmer weather. And the two places that were always nice temperatures, besides obviously Florida or whatever, but were always New Orleans and San Antonio. And that ended up that in our ministry, we ended up in both of those places. And New Orleans was a wonderful place to be. It was kind of like San Antonio, except the food that was great was the seafood and the Cajun food.
Yeah.
We would go out every Friday night and get a loaf of bread hollowed out with butterfly shrimp in it.
Oh, wow.
And it was like $6. And it was just wonderful food. The toughest part about New Orleans was not the congregation. The congregation was much like Shepherd, much like I think any congregation, full of people who loved their Lord, people who wanted to do good things for ministry and were dying to do so. But unfortunately, the leadership, not the pastoral leadership, but the leadership of the congregation, especially two of the officers, really were there, unfortunately, kind of like today's world as we see problems. They were there to keep the congregation a segregated congregation, and they were intentional about what they did in that direction.
Wow.
In fact, when we came, there were 4 brand new staff, and those brand new staff were inviting their kids to Sunday school, and Debbie invited an African American child and was told that child won't come back because he's in class with my grandson and he's not going to come back. Please don't bring him back again.
Wow.
And that was really tough. That was kind of shocking. And there were situations like that, but as a staff, we had a great time. We did things together, and we did things for what was there in the congregation. We painted the outside of the building, painted many of the rooms in the building. The gymnasium was smaller than our gym by far. That may seem hard to believe, but it was just really tight. And the locker rooms hadn't been used in a long time, so we cleaned out the showers and moved things to storage and made it a usable space again, in addition to just working and enjoying teaching. Debbie was teaching first grade, I was teaching fourth, and it was a wonderful place to be. New Orleans has great culture. It has Mardi Gras and everything else and all that goes with it. But it was obvious that this wasn't going to be where we were long term, and we found out very quickly why we were kind of pushed into or pulled into by the principal who came to visit with us, and we were just given the opportunity to go there. And so were 4 people from Concordia River Forest, but quickly realized that it wasn't necessarily a great situation to be in. And the placement director there realized that, and we talked with him, and that's kind of how we ended up here at Shepherd of the Hills. But in New Orleans, we actually had a very good school, very good time, just tough time for that congregation. That congregation actually ended up closing, but Debbie and I have gone back by it a couple of times, and it's now a Korean Baptist church, and by all indications, flourishing. So
wow.
God had a plan for it, even if it wasn't the plan that seemed to be there at the time.
Yeah, it's sad that things like what you described happen in a church. Efforts to keep the school segregated. What irony that now it's a Korean Christian church.
It's a very big irony as you look at it and you go, wow, God was moving and he had a plan. All things work for good, even if they're very difficult at the time.
Yeah. And obviously God had a different plan for you and Debbie. That plan wasn't for you to stay at the school in New Orleans, but after 1 year of ministry there, you received the call to come be principal here at the ripe old age of
24
years old as a principal of a school, which at that time was not as big as it is now. It was growing, but it was a significant responsibility. How many students in the school at the time you were called?
When we started that year, there were 41.
Okay.
And so it was a completely different environment. In fact, the building, there was the portable building where just about where we're sitting here. It was on this piece of the property, and there was the original church building, which is now down, but it had the first grade where all the offices were. There were no walls in it, and the first grade was there, and my 9 students in the second and third grade combined were across the hall, and that was just the school at the time. Plus, it had childcare down in the worship center, and as you know, people would say, if I was to die, I have to be buried in a childcare, because the childcare all week was what the worship center was, and then on Saturday everything went back underneath underneath the balcony, and all of the chairs that were brought out in the altar was set up, and there was worship service on Sunday, and so it was a true multi-space use building.
Yeah, really. Now, how did you feel about being invited to come and be principal of a school at age 24? How did they locate you as a teacher? And what did you think when you received the invitation?
Well, like I said, things were in New Orleans had been rough, and we had talked with the placement director and said, how do we handle this? These really, nobody trains you to expect this to happen in a congregation. And so we had been in contact with him, and he had realized that we weren't going to be there full time and felt kind of bad about that. So he went around some of the rules that were there for placement directors. It was his job to get the first call for people out, not to work with people in the field. Yeah. But Pastor Dan called and asked if they knew of anybody who might be interested or might be available to be principal. And Dr. Rachel gave our number to him, and he called. And I remember we were sitting in New Orleans in our apartment, and Debbie got this phone call and said, "What?" And then she put her hand over the phone and handed it to me, giggling, saying, "There's a pastor from San Antonio, and he wants to know if you're interested in a call to be principal." And then she had to stand up and walk away because she was laughing. So I get lots of appreciation from her, I guess.
That's right.
But that was a true blessing from God, and a true opportunity that we had to come here, and the opportunity to be a part of this ministry. We came the first time, and Pastor Dan came to pick us up to take us to his house, and he had been barbecuing, as he often did, as found out, and watching a Spurs game when the Spurs weren't winning. And he came to pick us up in his old Bonneville, and he had Joshua in his arms, and he jumped out over the door because the door didn't open, and came walking in, and our mom was there with us, and he said, "Mom, I think that's the pastor." And well, he had his tank top and his shorts on and his sandals on and holding the baby. And she said, "It can't be." And because she grew up in a German Lutheran church where the pastor still spoke German for one of the services when we were younger. And I said, "No, I think it is." And from that moment on, we developed a really wonderful relationship with him, and a ministry together. And it was obvious that it was going to be a different type of ministry than we had experienced in New Orleans right from the very beginning.
Very much.
And of different people, and a whole different positive, moving forward congregation.
And coming in at that early stage, you had the opportunity to shape the culture of the school. What were some things you had in mind as you were creating the culture or shaping the culture of what this would be for years to come? What were things that you wanted to bring to that environment?
Wanted, first of all, to make sure it was a place where everybody was included and everybody was welcome. Mm-hmm. It was a place where we could look at things and say, okay, this is a challenge. It just simply is a challenge, but there's got to be a way to get it done. So how are we going to how are we going to get it done, and how are we going to make it happen. Look to try to the best of our ability to provide not only the best education, but a place where people felt loved, cared for, comfortable, where there was an opportunity for people to really feel the love of Christ. And there are, from Judy Friesenhahn, Judy Trinkline at that time, to Kay Olson, who just retired, Kay Althagi at that time, Sue Gary, Sue Crackart at that time, when they came, who have all been here. Sue's the one had been here the least, and that was 35 years. And bringing in people who had a genuine love for Christ and a want to share that love with other people, and create a place where that would be that would be the reason that we're here.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you did very well were those early hires. I will say that we've had some long-time teachers and staff, and you couldn't pick finer people along with better teachers. Yeah. But the quality and sincerity of their faith, you named some of them, has been, I think, one of the greatest things.
They were a blessing from God.
Yep.
They were, because maybe some other 24-year-old does, but this 24-year-old really didn't have a clue. He just was blessed by God that there were people that stepped alongside him that did, and that he provided what was needed to make things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's fast forward to, I believe it was the year 2002, when you stepped into the role of Director of Operations, Sue Gary became principal. What happened at that point? I mean, after 21 years of being principal, did you feel that it was time to move into a new role? Did you feel that Sue was, just ready for that job, so you wanted to make room for her? What was the thought process in all of that?
It was probably a little bit of both, but it was time for Sue to make a decision. She was finishing her master's degree, and does she stay here, or does she take a call to be principal elsewhere? And the congregation had been looking for an associate pastor, an administrative pastor, and as you know, one of the very first things that pastors hope to be able to do when they get a call is to be an administrative pastor. Okay,
sure.
So sure, it's probably the last thing on the agenda for a pastor, and congregation was having a difficult time finding someone who wanted to do that role. In fact, had been turned down twice for that position. Pastor Dan and the boys and I, as we often did, we often went hunting. This time we went fishing. We came back on the way back on that fishing trip, and we're talking, and Pastor Dan says, I know that the current individual we've called golfs 2 or 3 times a week and really loves that. And he is not going to golf here 2 or 3 times a week because there's too much work to be done.
Now, deer hunting would be a different story.
Deer hunting might be a different story, but that would be for at least just a few months period of time.
That's it.
And so he did that, and we got back, and as we came back, we were driving back. He said, well, what if you became the administrator, and what would we do? I said, well, Sue's finishing up. She's either going to take a call and go elsewhere, or we can move her into that position. And so that's how I ended up being director of operations, and she took over principal role because that seemed to be the place that God was leading us in our congregation. And then the congregation didn't need to look for an administrative pastor, and ended up looking for and finding pastor to the school, and went from there.
Yeah, that's been one of the themes throughout the history of Shepherd, is how God has provided the right people at the right time. And that was one of those situations where things just lined up. There was a need for an administrator here. Sue was ready to make a transition in her career, and all of that seemed to have worked out very well. And here we are, all these years later, and you've been in that role of director of operations and helping to lead in many, many ways. So let's take a turn from talking about the professional side of things to the personal side, family side. We've talked about Debbie. Could you tell us a little bit more about who's in your family?
Debbie and my two boys, Andrew and Jacob, and a third one that really is considered a son, even though I'm his uncle, Kelsey, because Kelsey came to live with us. My sister Naomi, who was 4 years older than me, passed away when she was 33, when Kelsey was a freshman in high school. And so he came to live with us at that time. And so he became the older brother to my four boys. He ended up going in the Air Force and was in the Air Force for 24 years as a loadmaster and then as a teacher. But he's always been their older brother. And Jacob just took a new job from TxDOT to USDA and working as soil scientist. And Andrew is vice principal and works with teaching literature and English and technology at Lutheran High School.
Mm-hmm. And how many grandkids?
And 4 grandkids. 2 of them are Kelsey's, Tommy and Gatling, and 2 of them are Andrew's, Kylie and Austin. And that's one of the great joys that I have and Debbie has, is watching them play sports or being in plays or being in some different activity, and the privilege of having them here at Shepherd, and then the privilege of being able to have them in town so that we can go to their activities.
Absolutely, yeah. The joys of being a grandparent and being able to be involved in their lives.
Yeah, and right here. I mean, I can go to chapel with them each week and whatever it might be, but they're right here on campus. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And last year at least, if you weren't sitting next to Kylie, my boys wanted to sit next to Kylie. She was their buddy in chapel.
She's a sweetheart. Yeah.
Yeah, she is. Yeah. Well, looking back on all the things we've talked about and seeing how God has orchestrated things in your life, how would you say that your faith has helped you in your life journey?
My faith has been a part of my ministry, and it's been a part of my life all along. Martha Collins was my second grade teacher. She's the one who really made Jesus come alive and taught me that in everything you do, he should be there. And people will ask, how did you choose to teach? How did you choose to be in ministry? From second grade on, that was really my only choice. If somebody asked me, what are you going to do? It was, I'm going to be a teacher because of her. I saw her love, her care, her giving. There were other teachers and there were other times that I could name, but she was the person who did that and made that come alive. And I can say that, probably Debbie is the same kind of teacher, wife. She's the same kind of person that I saw in Mrs. Collins, and that was just a joy to be in her classroom. And still, after all these years, it's a joy to be just to fondly remember her and what she taught me about the faith, and how my faith just became alive because this is how Jesus would act, is kind of what she taught. And this is what you should do if you're following him. And a lot of the things that I do go back to that service kind of attitude and servant attitude she gave to her students.
Yeah, faith in action.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting for our listeners to think back on who's that person in your life who did that same thing, who instilled that way of thinking and service mentality and making Jesus such a central part of life. Yeah. Well, Tim, it's been a joy to have this conversation. It's a joy to partner in ministry with you. You certainly are a huge part of not just the history of Shepherd of the Hills, but the present moment at Shepherd of the Hills. I know your passion for the building project has been one of the things that has moved that project forward, and great days are ahead.
Yeah, they are. Thank you. It's a joy to be in ministry with you, and it's a joy to share that passion with our staff, because our past staff really has a passion to touch people with the love of Christ.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you again. And thank you for watching and being a part of this episode. I encourage you to check in next time for another interview. It's been great to share Tim's story with you today, and I know that you enjoyed it. And so until next time, take care of yourself. May the Lord watch over you and keep you safe and healthy. And God's blessings to you today.